Alrighty, guess we'll get ready to get started here today. Thank you everybody for joining us here live today and everybody watching the recording here on demand. Appreciate you taking the time to join us. We actually have a information-packed session here today as Justin Tweed presents on empowering junior engineers to write better requirements. I'll give a quick introduction for Justin. He joined our team about a year ago with an expertise in, I'd say, problem uncovering and problem discovery. It's really in that process of working with teams to identify the problem areas and looking for solutions to fix them that Justin excels at. So he's really dug into the space in the year that he's been with us here at QRA and brought a lot of his previous skills and knowledge in the sales world into his experience here as a very consultative approach to requirements and to the sales process here with us. He's one of our account executives here. So the topic today, empowering junior engineers, is actually coming a lot from Justin's personal experience in working with our clients. Most of his customers that he's working with are in the medical device space, and so requirements is obviously a big part of that design and development process that they have there. But you'll find that a lot of the principles and actually the topic of the discussion today is industry agnostic. So whether you're coming from a medical device background or working in one of the several other industries that Justin will talk about here as a part of his introduction, we hope that you'll find this to be valuable. It's actually an issue that we see with a lot of our customers as people are thrown into the requirements process and leaders are unsure of kind of how to train on best practices and how to get those engineers up to speed. And so Justin has prepared just an awesome presentation today that he'll be walking you through, and he'll give a little bit of an introduction here as we go. So throughout, we will have a poll question about partway through, and we're always open for questions throughout. So those of you that are attending live, just put your questions into the Q&A section there, and we will stop at a couple of points through the way, mostly probably at the end, but keep your questions coming throughout. We'll answer some in the chat, and then we'll review any questions that we think would be relevant to everyone here at the end of the call. So with that intro, I will turn things over to Justin, and he'll be walking you through the rest of the presentation here today. Justin?
Great. Thanks, James. And thank you everyone for joining us, like we said, live here and over the recording. So yeah, myself, Justin Tweed, and James Carr, who you just met, part of the sales team here at QRA. So we'll share all of our information afterwards. If anyone does have any questions that they can't get in today, or if you're watching the recording, or if you did want to connect and chat a little bit more about how we help, more than happy to connect afterwards. So for today, we're talking about empowering junior engineers to write better requirements. So in doing so, we're going to start out by defining what is a good requirement. It's not a straight definition by any means, but certainly moving towards better requirements means having a good idea of what a good requirement looks to you. Once you have a good idea of what a good requirement means to you and your team, the message is how to get that down to the junior engineers. So how we're going to facilitate knowledge transfer and ensure that people understand what is a good requirement. And then you need to verify that information. So at the end, we're going to talk about verifying the understanding of what a good quality requirement is, ensuring that your junior requirements and your your junior engineers and your experienced engineers both have an understanding and they're adhering to it as well. So a little bit more about us. QRA, we're based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. You can see an aerial view of Halifax there on the right-hand side. We actually started with a formal analyzer for model-based system engineering. That was our first tool called QB Trace. We're looking for kind of perfect storm scenarios within models. And we realized that a lot of the issues that we were highlighting were actually coming in from poorly defined requirements. So initially we went to the market, we tried to find a tool to complement ours and help out our customers with writing better requirements, and it didn't exist. So we ended up working and building QB Scribe. So eventually we figured out what the market already knew, that being that more than half of these issues are actually originating within poor quality requirements, and that's where we shifted our focus. So that's where we are today. For the last 5+ years, we've been focused on our tool QB Scribe, and now we work with some of the world's largest teams in complex engineering, so that being oil and energy, defense and space, automotive, transportation, government, aerospace, consulting, and medical services. So yeah, we're talking about more than just junior engineers today. In a lot of our work, we help a lot of teams that have a lot of experienced engineers, but the nature of this area, these complex engineering teams, it's constantly changing. And some of these industries have really just started to accept the importance of high quality writing. So this conversation and the guidelines that we're going to introduce within it it's suited for more than just junior engineers for sure. So where we see teams looking for help is in the specific situation of junior engineers, new to the industry or workforce, fresh out of school, maybe studied requirements but don't have any real life experience using it, or alternatively have used requirements, written requirements in a less complex space where the restrictions, the regulations of the industry aren't severe, and the rigor really needed to write the requirements isn't as extreme. We work with a lot of people that are new to requirements writing. So those would be subject matter experts. Oftentimes, they work with requirements almost on a daily basis. They really understand project scope, but because of that, they're expected to, okay, hey, for this next project, can you actually write the requirements? But of course, I'm sure as a lot of people have experienced, the nature of understanding project scope and requirements and being able to interpret what they're saying versus having a blank piece of paper, and the entire extent of the English language is a completely different beast. And then we work with a lot of larger teams, whole groups, whole organizations that are looking to update best practices. Of course, as we've discussed, projects are starting to get more and more complex across all complex engineering industries. There's the introduction of AI, robotics, stricter regulations, and a lot of teams are realizing that the way that they've done things just isn't sufficient anymore. So let's get into it. What is a good requirement? So, of course, the first step to empowering your engineers to write better requirements is to define what you and your organization accept as the proper characteristics of a good requirement. Now, this isn't black and white. There's no clear definition, and I don't intend to give you one, but we're going to talk about a lot of the resources that are available to, add to the discussion and guide you to determine exactly what is right for your particular situation. What we found working around requirements and with our customer base for the last number of years is that across the board, these three characteristics are always accepted as must-haves in good requirements. So that being the requirements must be complete, clear, and verifiable. So a requirement statement needs to be made in its entirety. There cannot be information either omitted or assumed. If you send out requirements to a third-party organization and you're not clear that something needs to be done, it's being assumed that it needs to be done, they make the bid on it and they see an option to, avoid a certain requirement because it's not clear that they're responsible for it, then it's pretty likely that they're going to do so. And that's a situation we see pretty frequently. So if something must be done, it needs to be clear that it must be done. A requirement statement needs to be clear. If every person that needs to interact with a requirement cannot properly understand the requirement, then that's a problem. This is complicated by a lot of organizations. I'm sure people that are joining us today are multinational. A lot of people aren't English first language. Of course, a lot of people that interact with requirements as well aren't necessarily from an engineering background. So, picking the exact right terminology to use to explain how to do something to convey that is a very complex task. But if something must be done, it needs to be clear what must be done and, in what situation it needs to be done. And then a requirement needs to be verifiable as well. So for a lot of the industries that we work with, there's actually requirements based on the industry regulations that there must be a mechanism that a requirement is verifiable. And, oftentimes this means that getting to the verification stage, you realize that you're working with a requirement that's not verifiable and there's a lot of rework. You're moving back a number of steps and, obviously the cost and project timelines effects of moving back those steps to work on them. Or oftentimes it actually means that a project gets released into the market and there can be recalls and lawsuits in the worst case scenario. So being complete, clear, and verifiable at the bare minimum is what you need for a requirement. And, as I mentioned earlier, over 50% of project issues that we see originate in poorly defined requirements. And these compile and they get more and more expensive to resolve the further down the development process that these poorly defined requirements go. So, they really lead to a lot of issues. These are some of the biggest ones that we see: delays in procurement, project cost increases, buying the wrong thing, inflated pricing, undiscovered risk, wasted time. Ensuring requirements are complete, clear, and verifiable before they guide the remainder of development helps to avoid these negative impacts and keeps with the timelines and budget expectations. Just a little story of one of our earliest customers, and they were in the oil and gas space. And because of bad requirements, they ran into billions of dollars of overruns and basically all of these negative impacts that you see here. So by the way that the requirements were written, they had two subcontractors that both assumed the other side was responsible for a critical component that was connecting two systems that were transferring crude oil. So production started at sea, and then they realized that the two systems could not connect, and the entire operation had to halt. It had to be stopped, and they had to wait for the additional part to be manufactured and delivered. And in the end, the platform had to be delayed and for years, and the company opted to make significant investments in this space to ensure that that didn't happen again. So let's talk about how you get there. How do you get to a better quality requirement? So there's a number of best practices out there. At the bare minimum, every industry that everyone's working with is going to have some degree of industry regulations, and the requirements need to meet out the rules that are laid out in those industry regulations. This is different for every industry. More than happy to converse with anyone afterwards if they have any questions around, what might be relevant to them. But, empowering your engineers to write good quality requirements, the first step is to know the exact rules of the industry that you're working with. You then have groups like the IIBA, the International Institute of Business Analysis, and the International Council on System Engineering, INCOSE, and they put together guidelines on good requirements. Those are industry agnostic. They get used across various teams, across various industries, some using them at face value, and then others adjusting them and making little tweaks or omitting certain rules to fit the actual process that they're trying to create. And we'll actually introduce a couple of those rules to you momentarily as well. There's then standardized formatting for writing requirements. And a great example of that are the ones introducing EARS, the easy approach to requirement syntax. This is just a set of patterns that ensures that requirements are always being structured the exact same, no matter who's behind them. Again, we'll show you a little bit more of that in a moment here. There's, of course, a number of white papers and other formats as well, but EARS is the most widely adopted, and it's one that we've actually built into our tool as well, and we strongly endorse. And then it's also important to know which rules to apply and when. So whether you're making your own rules and formatting or adopting predefined ones like INCOSE and EARS, it's important to be flexible and understand when certain rules should be omitted or when you should actually add to them. Whether that means being less strict for higher level requirements, like stakeholder requirements, or being less strict at low level requirements, more strict for low level requirements like subsystem requirements, or just understanding when certain rules actually add more complication to a project than they actually do benefit it. So yeah, with the goal in mind of creating complete, clear, and verifiable requirements, let's take a look at the Business Analyst Book of Knowledge. They introduce 9 rules for requirement writing. That being, a requirement must be atomic, complete, consistent, concise, feasible, unambiguous, testable, prioritized, and understandable. Now, of course, this builds upon those 3 rules that we introduced earlier and gets more specific on them. The thing is, these issues tend to compile and interrelate. An ambiguous requirement is not often understandable or testable, but looking at these areas individually and breaking them into more specific groupings makes for easier analysis, and working on actually correcting them. So then the INCOSE guide for writing requirements has actually broken that down significantly further into 41 rules for good quality requirements. These are the most widely adopted guidelines, and they're the actual rule set that we've integrated into our program, QV Scribe, and we've built our analysis on that. The benefit of more rules is it allows the rules to be properly understood. It could be said that the statement that a requirement must be complete, clear, and verifiable is in itself incomplete, unclear, and unverifiable. So, breaking these down into 41 rules makes it pretty clear what each of these rules actually means. On the other hand, is this potentially information overload that will either overwhelm, be forgotten, or be ignored altogether? These are important things to consider when defining the rules that you want your team to follow. And of course, as we mentioned before, it's always good to be flexible and understand which ones are more relevant at a certain time or more relevant for a certain industry and might actually be better to be ignored or not taught at another level. So knowing the components of a good requirement is a great start, but equally important is understanding how to structure it. So standardized formatting like EARS, they lay out the structure so that your junior engineers can focus on getting the content without stressing about how to format it. So implementing patterns like ears organization-wide, it also ensures that no matter who is behind the requirement, it's always going to read the same way. So as you can see here, we've got the 6 ears patterns. They also break down into complex patterns, but more or less, this is how ears requirements are always going to be written. The system response always comes at the end. Free conditions always come at the beginning. And in between is more or less a kind of fill in the blank type of thing. So if you can understand the content that needs to be in there, then you can understand the structure by using something like ears. And again, it ensures that this formatting is always going to remain the same. Now, there are circumstances where ears formatting isn't the best option, but they are limited. And yeah, we've actually built the ears templates, so you can use them right inside QB Scribe, our tool, and we have conformance checks there. And again, I'll show you that momentarily. But yeah, James, I believe we have a poll here. If we can bring that up, and we'll chat about that before we move on.
Sure. Yeah, we'll kick the poll off here now. See the question up on your screen. I talked about a couple of different rule sets that are out there for requirement writing. Some of these will be an estimation, but the question should be up on your screen there now. How many rules does your team use for writing? And the variations there would be 5 or less, 5 to 30, 30 or more, or none. So we'll give you a few moments to get your answers in, and then we'll review those and come back to those in a few minutes. We do have a couple of questions that have come in so far as well. We'll touch on those in just a few minutes here when we go over these results as well. And yeah, well, thanks for all the answers that have come in so far. We'll review those here with you shortly.
All right, thanks, James. Yeah, so defining rule sets, guidelines, formatting standards, it's a great start, but empowering your engineers requires proper understanding and buy-in. So for example, another one of our customers in the defense space, they put the time and effort into creating a detailed process and clearly defined how they want their requirements to be defined. But then they realized that it was difficult to get everyone to reference these resources and even more time consuming to verify that they were being followed. So as a result, they had different teams and different individuals that were doing things their own way. With the frequency of employee movement within organizations and then leaving organizations for another in the modern day, it's more important than ever to ensure that this knowledge doesn't leave with those employees. So you add to that the extremely competitive landscape of many industries. You have to compete with your traditional competitors, and then there's also a constant influx of startups coming in that disrupt customer bases. So having the trust of your customers, your investors, and your partners, that the departure of one individual won't be detrimental to the operation is extremely important. Again, there's a number of ways to do this, work towards knowledge transfer. We'll discuss a few of those today, but there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We usually recommend a mixture or a number of techniques, and we can chat about a few here. And again, please feel free to reach out afterwards if you'd like to chat a bit more. So yeah, documenting processes. So where it helps is basically for company-wide standards and objective sources of truth. If you have things that have been agreed upon on a company-wide level and they can easily be relayed by the written word, then you can task anybody who's new to the organization, junior engineers, anybody to study these rules and ensure that they understand them before they move on to actually doing their work. There's no debate to be had here as well. There's no subjectivity. A big problem that we see a lot of the time is that experienced engineers haven't been willing to adapt with the changes in requirement writing that have changed as the complexity of projects have changed. And there's no space with process documenting for that subjectivity or that bias and those kind of bad practices to get passed on to another generation. Of course, there's a number of difficulties with it. How do you properly explain the nuances with anything? But specifically with requirement writing, it's an area that's not necessarily that complex in theory. You're just writing down words and explaining how to do things, but I'm sure that we all realize the actual complexity of it, but it's very difficult to actually explain that. The importance of certain rules, why guidelines are important, horror stories of what happened because of a certain bad thing. So it's a difficult thing to really put down in writing. Of course, it's going to require updating. Do you use engineers who are actively working in real life situations and understand requirements and have dealt with these particularly detrimental situations to update the rules in the terminology that engineers understand, and in turn take them away from their work and assume that they actually have the technical abilities to update processes in an administrative way. Or alternatively, do you use administrative people who do know how to update processes but don't necessarily have that real world experience to talk about it? Knowledge retention is going to be a big thing, especially in the same way of the difficulty to properly explain how complex certain of these rules are to actually adhere to. It's difficult to put that down in writing, and I know that we all have experience skimming over things and not really taking much in. Certainly, when it's specific rules, it just seems so logical, but when it actually comes into practice, they're not. It's really risky that knowledge isn't going to be retained. And then again, ensuring adherence, right? So who's in charge of ensuring adherence to these processes? Do you have your experienced engineers constantly checking these new processes as they get updated, or are they still writing based on the way that they've always done things? And if that is the case, who's in charge of ensuring adherence? The people that are still doing things the way that you don't want it to be done, or the new people that know the rules well, but of course they're new and they don't understand all the other complexities of actually reviewing these things? So of course there's peer training. This allows you to get that real life experience and the ability to elaborate and answer questions. Tell those horror stories of when one word sent the whole thing awry, and answer questions and elaborate on the importance of certain rules and those various things. Of course, that assumes that the people that are going to be in charge of training, these experienced engineers, actually have the capability of being top-notch trainers, because of course that doesn't necessarily, being a good engineer doesn't mean that you're a good trainer. You also risk the time value of these employees. So if you're taking your top engineers away from work to do training, is their work going on pause? Do they have somebody taking over their work while they're away? Do you trust somebody to take over their work? Do they trust somebody to take over their work? Do you risk missing project timelines and holding things up because you want to use your top-notch engineers to train your new employees? And then, of course, there's the question of bias as well. Are they actually following the rules as you've laid them out? As you've adapted to these new rules, are your engineers that have been doing this for a long time saying, this, I've always done it, it works fine for me, I'm going to continue doing it this way? Or are they using the rules that you want them to? And if they're not, are you, again, risking bringing in another generation of engineers that are kind of doing things their own way and not the way that you want it done? You have the option of external training. So in the same way as your experienced engineers and that peer training, you should have that real life experience. Typically these people have worked in the industry and then they've opted to go independent. So they have the same ability to elaborate, answer questions, really talk from that real world experience type of situation. And theoretically, they should be good teachers. This is their field of work. They train on a regular basis. They should be capable of doing so at a high level. Of course, their experience isn't going to be the exact same. As we've discussed already, no two situations are the same. Within industries, within organizations, it's always good to have different rule sets, and it's always important to, be able to explain why this is important to our team and might not be important to this other team at our organization working on a different project. At the same time, are they going to teach the rules as you want them taught, or are they going to come in and have their own set that they specifically like to teach? If that is the case, they want to teach their own rules. Are you bringing your entire team of requirement engineers in to learn these new rules? Are you bringing your experienced engineers that have been there for 20 plus years in to learn it as well? And if you're not, and these are the rules that you're trying to implement on an industry, organizational level, do you create a power imbalance by teaching the new rules and training to a high level the new rules into your junior engineers while your senior engineers are still working with the same old rules that you don't want to see anymore? In that same way, how do you ensure adherence? If your older engineers who have more experience and should be the ones that are reviewing requirements and identifying the problematic terms don't really know the new ones that you've taught, or again, haven't actually bought into the new ones you've taught, how are they going to be able to identify the problem terms as you've laid them out, the rules as you've laid them out? Of course, in the same way, how do you expect your junior engineers who are new in the space and don't understand the complexity of it to come in and do that as well? And then knowledge retention, in the same way, it's a very difficult thing to retain that knowledge. And of course, this isn't somebody that works in your organization, so it's not going to be readily, easily to available to reach out to them and, kind of reiterate what you've learned before. Yeah, so we'll dive into the last section in a moment here. James, maybe if we want to run over the poll results.
Yeah, we'll jump into one question first, and then we'll get those out for everyone. Any other questions we'll look into answering at the end here, but we'll take this one right now. And I could actually cover it. Would be many of our customers consider themselves agile. They only write user stories, which oftentimes are inadequate. How can we get them to write really good requirements? In our experience, I've seen a couple of different angles you could take this. The big problem, and thank you for that question, Winton. The big problem that we see in this area is careful terminology you use there, consider themselves agile, is you move into a mindset where it's, okay, the waterfall approach or using a V model, that's old school, and we're going with this new approach where we're just going to use user stories and we can work through the process a lot more efficiently that way. And there's a little bit of a situation where, throwing the baby out with the bathwater is present there, where it's like, well, requirements used to have to be really detailed and specific and say exactly what we wanted the thing to do. Now we can put them in as a user story, and if it's not exactly right, we have the chance to iterate on it repeatedly until we get to that end point. And the thing that we see in this space, especially on the complex projects, it's one thing if you're working with like a small team or a specific module or feature that you're working to develop, is different than working on a large scale project that has a lot of interdependencies and connections with different systems and different teams. And so if you approach the project in saying, oh, well, we can fix it later and we can move this into the later stages and, iterate on it as necessary. A lot of the time, if you don't spend the time defining upfront how good or how clear the requirement of the user story needs to be, you can have the same issue. It's just repeating the same things multiple times instead of ending up with a big issue later on. So you have those checks and balances in place of like short review cycles to be able to review the requirements ahead of time, or to review them more often, I should say, as you go through those cycles. But if they're only user stories and those definitions aren't very clear and they're inadequate, then you're likely to waste cycles unnecessarily by, say you're using the agile cycles, you might spend 5 cycles running through something that you could actually do in 2 if the requirements were properly defined. So in terms of making the case of why you should invest in higher quality requirements or user stories, that idea of, well, you don't want to go, whether you're using a user story or requirement, you don't want to be doing work based on an assumption. You want to actually know what the thing is supposed to deliver, what that product is supposed to do. And so the 2 ways to handle it. One is that you use user stories in conjunction with requirements. You can think of them as like textual requirements versus modeling. You use both of those together to be able to say, hey, this gives us another perspective. We're really seeing the customer's perspective or the user's perspective on how they'll interact with this, as opposed to just seeing it as a particular feature. So you could have, user stories to define those early stage high level requirements and then actually use those as the basis for your requirements that you'll use to develop. Or the other way would be actually apply some of those principles of what makes a good requirement into the user stories. So reduce vague language that's being used. Use a tool like we're going to talk about with QBScribe for requirements to actually analyze the user stories as well and look for those areas where somebody could read it and actually misinterpret what's being said or notice that it's written in a way that you couldn't actually prove whether that requirement has been met or not. Saying something will be user-friendly or intuitive or something like that doesn't really give the developer or the engineer a lot of guidance on how to do that. So a little bit of a longer answer to that short question, but certainly happy to connect with anyone that wants to talk any more on that as well. And with that, we will share the results of the poll here with everyone. So how many rules does your team use for writing? We had 19% respond with 5 or less. 5 to 30, which was our largest at 44%, said working with between 5 and 30 rules that they expect their teams to follow. 25% had 30 or more rules that they're trying to enforce, and there were 13% that responded with none. So in this case, we're seeing a nice clean curve there, which is always good to see in looking at these sorts of results. So the majority are in that sort of 5 to 30 range. So that could be anywhere from the International Business Analysts Book of Knowledge book. Between that and INCOSE, sort of in the middle there between those two ranges. But some interesting results, and we do have folks on the call here, obviously, that are consultants and others that work on teams, so there might be a little bit of ambiguity in the answers there as well. But it seems like most are in that sort of mid-range of between 5 and 30. So thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts on that, and keep the questions coming through the chat. We will address those towards the end as well.
Great. Yeah, and that's something that we often see as well. As I've talked about a number of times over this, there's no clear set of rules. We can't say that the team that has 30 rules is doing better than the team that has 5 rules. It's really about finding what works for your organization, and again, being flexible on what works for the specific project. So let's talk about the last section here. We're going to talk about verifying understanding and adherence. So, you've identified those specific guidelines, the rule sets, the best practices that fit your organization. You've created reliable means of facilitating that knowledge transfer amongst your teams. Now you just need to verify that these are, being understood and that they're being followed. So another customer story of ours, we worked with the Canadian government organization, and they had the goal of decreasing the time that they spend on requirements and also increasing the clarity of the writing. So, of course, this is a really complex area to, make both of these improvements at the same time. So this is an area that we ended up coming in and helping improve the quality, the consistency of their writing by using our tool cuvScribe. And in turn, they were able to take their review meetings that typically last them about a week, and they got it down to a day. So we'll show you how that looks in a minute, but let's talk about, for example, the INCOSE guide for writing requirements. As we mentioned before, this is the most widely accepted guide for writing requirements. Not sure if anybody in the meeting here in the conversation today is using them. That would be fit more on, as James mentioned, kind of the 30 plus area. But yeah, obviously teaching these 41 rules here is a daunting task in itself. But the reality of adhering to these rules actually means avoiding hundreds of violations. So we've broken the rules down to these hundreds of violations, and this is what we programmed the tool with to begin with. Working with our customer base and requirements for the last 5 years. So, the nature of verifying adherence to these rule sets, it typically means manual review by your experienced engineers. Of course, this comes with the complication around, the bias, the subjectivity of those engineers, as well as the time value of these employees. If they need to manually review these documents, identify violations, send them back to the original writer, explain why they're problematic, and then review the adjustments made, theoretically, they could have just easily have written the requirements from the start themselves. Of course, over time, you would hope that your junior engineers, make less of these violations, they understand the rules. But, as we discussed before, the nature of the industries that, everyone really works in here with the complex engineering is that project complexity is always changing. There's always new things to learn. And then there's constant movement of staff as well. You can't be confident that your junior engineers are going to stay for long enough that they're going to get to the level that they're writing high quality requirements. So let's talk about how we help. So our tool, cuvScribe, it eases the burden of creating the specific rule sets for your teams. It comes configured to analyze for adherence and highlight those violations that we just showed for the best practices that are introduced in the INCOSE guide for writing requirements. As you work with cuvScribe and determine which rules you would like to add or what you would like to be omitted from it, it's easily configurable to your specific situation. You can easily configure as many configurations as you like, maybe creating more strict analyses for low-level requirements and then less strict for high level, or introducing different configurations for each of your unique projects that you're doing. Along with highlighting violations, cuvScribe also offers guidance on how to improve your requirements. So this facilitates knowledge transfer by empowering junior and experienced engineers to self-correct and self-train on the requirement best practices that you want your teams to follow. So by saving these configurations as well, this knowledge is retained, and as experienced engineers depart your organization, ensuring that your engineers at all level are able to still write at that high quality requirement and no one individual needs to be expected to be tied down for that tedious review work. It's able to be handled by cubescribe. So we'll show you a quick demo of the tool. We'll show you 3 of the base analyses that we run here within cubescribe. So quality analysis is looking for a general risk score of each requirement within a requirement set. It's looking for requirements that are unclear and not testable, like we mentioned at the beginning. They have the risk of being misunderstood. They're too vague to be proven when it comes to that V&V stage of production. Then we're looking at consistency and similarity. Consistency, looking for the terms and the units that have been used throughout, and ensuring that you're not using multiple names for the same object and you're remaining within the same system of units. Similarity is comparing requirement to requirement. It's looking for duplication of information or a contradiction of information when requirements are compared to each other. For today, we'll show you how cubescribe looks within Excel, but we do have integrations for Polarian, Doors Next, and JAMA. And then more than half of our customer base are working with some other requirement management tool, and that will interface with cubescribe, typically through Excel, but also through Microsoft Word, either through an export or a round trip. But we can chat about that more later on. Let's get into the tool here. So you can see I have my Excel screen up here, and I have just a small requirement document here, 22 requirements. This is for a cruise control system, so an automotive type document, very easily understood by any organization. And we can see that I have my cubescribe panel on the right-hand side. Now, each of these scores, anywhere from 1 out of 5, is a general risk score of the requirements as they're written. This is based on the configuration that we're using. In the case of starting out with cubescribe, that'll be based on the INCOSE guide for writing requirements and the changes that we've made, the violations that we've introduced as problematic by working with customers across various industries, but you have the ability to adjust these as you see fit. So in the way of creating rule sets and allowing your team to learn these, you have the ability to teach INCOSE right off the bat, but also the flexibility to go into configurations, add or remove any terms as you see fit. A great example of this, we talked about experienced engineers that sometimes hang on to old terminology that you don't want to use anymore, but they continue to do so because they've always done it that way. If you want to ensure that that name doesn't come out, you can add that in. In this situation, theoretically old name, that gets added in. That's going to be highlighted as problematic within the tool, and it's going to be told that they need to correct this if they want to move on with a high quality score. Any of these categories can be toggled on and off as well. This allows you to create different analyses for those high level and low level requirements. We had the question around user needs. If you wanted to analyze the user needs that you take in, you might not want to analyze them, at the strict level that you would with subsystem requirements. So you can feel free to toggle off any of these categories as you see fit and create those specific configurations for that. So if we look into a specific issue here, specific requirement, you can see it gets highlighted within here. And the issues that have been highlighted based on the configuration that we've created are elaborated upon within my cubescribe panel. So let's start right here. We've used the term immediately. So cubescribe is going to recommend in this situation, given this is a non-specific temporal word, to replace it with specific timing constraints. Immediately is not verifiable. How do you verify that something has been done immediately? It's not clear. I don't know when I read immediately what you were thinking when you wrote immediately. And ultimately, this requirement isn't complete. If any component of the system fails, i.e. controller, radar, etc., then the system will disengage immediately. What's the etc.? I don't know what that means. We haven't met complete, clear, or verifiable. So cubescribe is going to recommend how to improve upon that, allowing your junior engineers to self-learn, self-correct, and understand what a good quality requirement looks like. So if I take this information that's given to me when I hover over top here, replace immediately with a specific timing constraint. If I change this to disengage within 0.2 seconds, and then I reanalyze this specific requirement, you can see I'm at a 2 out of 5. I'm going to move up to a 3 out of 5. So now I have a couple of remaining issues. Again, the recommendation is going to be given to me exactly how to improve upon this. In this place of etc., replace the open-ended clause with the information that's being alluded to. What do I mean when I say etc.? To talk about the ears formats, the patterns that we introduced earlier. If I wanted to rewrite this requirement as a whole using the patterns that have been introduced in the ears formatting, I can place these requirement templates. So you can see this has identified this requirement as an unwanted behavior requirement. So if I want to start from the top, place this requirement template in, I can just fill in the blanks. So instead of saying if any component of the system fails, i.e. controller, etc., I can speak of the specific components and ensure that this etc. is not adding that complication, that unclear, that lack of clarity, and that unverifiability of it. So if I say, if the radar fails, then the system shall disengage within 0.2 seconds. You can see I can reanalyze all of these requirements here. Reanalyze them all. And I've just created a 5 out of 5 high quality requirement conforming to the ears unwanted behavior with the specific components picked out within there. So this really allows you to get those rules in there, adjust them as you see fit with the configurability, teach these formatting, specifically the ears formatting. Again, this could be toggled on and off if you don't like the ears formatting, but certainly it's an easy way to get your junior engineers up to a high level, and then empower them to self-learn, self-correct, and get to a better level, without going through the rigor of training, documenting processes, and all of that. There's a couple of additional features of QBScribe here. James, did you want to get into some questions there, or we can just touch on a couple more features at the end if we get a chance?
Yeah, sure. There is one question on certification. So what do you think is the best certification for requirements engineering? With that one, it does depend on your discipline. There's obviously people writing requirements from a lot of different angles. We've used IREB internally before, so that's the International Requirements Engineering Board, has a certification program that you can go through training with different organizations. So we have IREB certified people here at QRA, including on our customer success team that works with customers. If someone's coming at it from a business analysis perspective, then certainly going through IIBA's certification process to be a certified business analyst professional, that would be a good path to take. But what we see a lot of the time is the people that are charged with writing requirements, and this varies from industry to industry. The folks that are charged with actually writing requirements as a part of a project, that's not really their full-time position. So they're working as a systems engineer, they're working as a mechanical engineer or project manager, and requirements becomes a part of that process for them. And so the IREB certification is good for kind of a broad-based general knowledge of the requirements, but there are certainly certifications for individual processes there as well. There was a question as well, is QBScribe and JAMA's requirement advisor related to each other? So we are a JAMA partner, and so QBScribe is available within JAMA. A lot of the features that you'll see here, like the consistency checks and similarities, there are more robust features within QBScribe in terms of configurability, looking at sets of requirements within JAMA, things like that that are a little bit different from that, but they're not affiliated with each other. So the checks for the individual requirements that can be scanned within the requirements advisor within JAMA would be different than those within QBScribe. And also one key difference for some of our customers working with it is that the analysis for QBScribe takes place on the local workstation. So there's not a cloud component involved with that of the requirements being sent off. But certainly the end goal of improving the quality of the requirements across the board, of elevating that, is there for both. And certainly JAMA would recommend, well, we've seen in their videos, recommending getting in touch with other vendors who have more customizability and things like that, if the needs are there for it. And that's certainly where we would come in if a tool like that isn't meeting the basic needs. Another difference here
Yeah,
is
maybe.
we're seeing obviously this within QBScribe for Excel. The configurations you create within QBScribe do cross over between different platforms. So for organizations that are using kind of Word and Excel earlier in the process or have different management tools in use for different customers that they work with, that consistency of the same QBScribe checks being available in those different platforms is something that for kind of more mature organizations that have different tools in use, like that part of it as well. So thank you for the questions there. Those are the only ones we have up there right now, Justin. So we'll watch for any other ones that come in. And yeah, sorry to cut you off there, Justin, if you had anything else to add to that.
No, no problem. Just before you get into another question, I didn't know if you had one. I figured, given the comparison between the two, wouldn't hurt to dive into consistency and similarity and show some of the additional features. And again, if anybody does have any additional questions, I'll save some time. I'll move through these portions pretty quickly. But yeah, so to talk about some of the other features of QBScribe here. So consistency, it's looking at the document as a whole. There's no scoring component of this. It's not a risk assessment like it is with the quality analysis. It's just giving you a different lens to look at your document. So in this situation, we're looking at units. We're pulling out all of the units that have been used throughout. At the beginning of this discussion here, mentioned, multinational organizations, teams are based all over the place. Just as difficult as it is for somebody to write a requirement in a language that's not their first language, it's also difficult at times to write in a system of units that you don't necessarily use. With projects really crossing oceans, between them, it's a simple thing that often gets overlooked and something that, you don't want to leave the conversion up to the engineers that are working at the latter stage or, ultimately not meet exactly what was requested at the requirement definition level because the conversion was done incorrectly. So QBScribe highlights the units that have been used throughout. This is just a small document, so there's just a few units, but what you're able to do is filter it based on consistent or inconsistent with the international system of units. Allows you to easily ensure that you've remained consistent in that, and any unit that is outside of the system of units you want to use gets converted before it moves on. Term consistency is pulling out all the nouns and noun phrases that have been used throughout. So an advantage of this is to analyze the similar requirements side by side. I can take all of the system requirements and look at them side by side. I can also move this matching strength and get the similar type of requirements here. So the system malfunction, and this is the acronym for the cruise control system, and I can compare those side by side. I can also identify when I've not been consistent on my term usage. So I can see here that we've mentioned the driver 10 times. We've also mentioned the user 2 times. So I'm going to want to go into these requirements, ensure that when I've mentioned this, the system will have set following distance available to the user that allows the vehicle to slow down and stop in the front vehicle. We're referring to the driver here, right? So we want to ensure that we're being consistent on our term usage, and this allows you to easily highlight that. Similarity, similar to consistency, there's no score, just comparing requirement to requirement in this situation. So I have a similar threshold across the top here. If I were to move it all the way to 100%, only 2 requirements that are the exact same are going to come up. Then I can determine at this point whether they both need to be within the document or not. As I pull this backwards, you'll see that I have more and more that are less and less similar coming up side by side. So when I compare these side by side, these two being 87% similar, I can see the similarities in red and the differences in green. Allows me to easily analyze if these requirements have contradicted each other, if they are saying the same thing, if they both need to be in here, or if they are saying, the same thing, but they both need to be in here because maybe they belong to two different functions or 2 different components. Have I included enough information within them for them to be easily discernible from each other? You don't want to have a requirement that's relying on the section, the header that is existing within. You want it to be workable on its own, traceable on its own, independent of all the other requirements. So this easily allows you to identify that contradiction, duplication, or omittance of necessary information and work on it from there.
Awesome. Yeah, we do have another question that's come in, so I'll touch on that here now. They have here in this example, you've seen the word will used throughout. So the question is, your example requirements use will as a keyword. EARS uses shall. Isn't it better to use shall for mandatory requirements? Justin, you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly are big endorsers of shall. By no means will we say that will is absolutely cannot be used, but that's part of the reason that, comparing, just to go back to the JAMA versus QV Scribe, the configurability of QV Scribe really adds that benefit of you allowing you to enforce the specific rule sets that you want to have within your requirements. So we have a rule within our configuration called missing imperative. So you can see that we've defined shall, must, and will as acceptable imperatives within this document. If any of these are not existing within a requirement, it's going to be given an automatic 1 out of 5 score. This is high risk. It doesn't tell you to do anything. It's not a requirement. If you want to only use shall, you absolutely have the ability to do so. I can remove will and must. They'll still remain over on the side here because these are the pre-programmed ones that we've added in. But now, if a requirement doesn't include shall, it's going to be given that 1 out of 5 score. I've defined that this document, this project that we're working on, is specifically shall statements. It needs to be included in every single one. If I put will in here, it's not going to be deemed a good quality requirement, and it's going to be given that 1 out of 5 score. In the same way, if you did want to be less strict, maybe at the user needs level, for example, you can add in something. So if you wanted to say could, I wouldn't recommend it, but you could add that in. And again, that'll be determined as an acceptable imperative, and it will be given a appropriate mark, and it won't be docked marks because it didn't include a shall, because it did include a could statement. Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, and from that perspective, we have customers working in different industries. So, for example, like an ISO standard uses those terms in a very controlled way. You would have for organizations that we work with that are developing standards, you would have, shall is a requirement, should is a recommendation, and then you have may and can that would be an allowance or a permission. And so in that workflow, you could add those as the imperatives, and basically it will make sure, according to that list, that every requirement has one, but only one of each of those phrases. So it allows you to configure it. Where QV Scribe is used for everything from user stories to low-level system requirements to standards that are being used within an organization. The different language of whether it's must or shall or will, that's configurable within the tool. And as Justin showed, those terms that we have in there as a starting point are just that. So only certain team members in an organization have the ability to edit these configurations, but the different custom configurations that you have for different purposes are shared across all users in all versions of the software. So everybody's on the same page with the language that's going to be used there. So absolutely a really great question. And that was actually the last one that we had there for questions right now here. So feel free to get in touch with us afterwards if there's any additional follow-up. Thanks for the great questions.
Perfect. So yeah, before we let everyone go here, we just got 5 minutes to the hour. We'll show you one more feature that really allows you to eliminate the subjectivity of, the review process, let's call it. So you have the ability to turn all of this information that we just covered within QV Scribe into a PDF report. So this can be shared with any external stakeholders. The question of user needs that came up earlier, if you wanted to use QV Scribe and say, hey, listen, we've analyzed these user needs. They don't make any sense. These are the areas that you need to improve upon. And then we'll be able to give you, a proper pricing. We'll give you a proper timeline. You can feel free to share these back to people, right? These can also be brought to review meetings. So I can see that on this date at this time, using this configuration that I've specifically defined as the project leader, I have this many high-risk requirements, this many low-risk requirements, and anywhere in between. So again, this takes that subjectivity, that bias, that agreeance to some rules and disagreements with others, from experienced engineers, junior engineers, anywhere in between, and it puts it down on paper and allows you to really discuss things as you see them and as you've defined them as the leader of a project. So this is another great benefit of the tool that you can bring and share this information with anybody as you see fit. So yeah, if we don't have any questions left there, James, I'm not sure if anything else has come up.
No, I think we're ready to wrap things up here. So I do want to let everybody know about some upcoming events that we have as well. Thank you again, Justin, for the great presentation today, and for everyone that attended live. Also, for those that are watching the recording here after the fact, I'm going to share my screen quickly and show our upcoming events page. So if you go to qracorp.com, right at the top of the screen, you have our resources. There's a couple of links you can look at there under the resources section. So one would be virtual events. The other is webinars and podcasts. So under webinars and podcasts, you'll see our previously recorded sessions and podcasts that are available and other webinars that we've hosted. And if you go to virtual events, you'll actually see the upcoming event. The next one that we have coming up is So You've Outgrown Your Spreadsheet, how to know when it's time to consider moving to more advanced tooling for your requirements project. I'll be hosting that one along with another one of our account executives, Derek Trider. And you can see the description there just by going to qracorp.com and then navigating to our virtual events section there under the heading. So we hope that you join us for that one. It's going to be on January 26th at the same time as the webinar that we hosted here today. Registration for that is open, so you can go and put your information in, and we'll hope to see you at that one. Again, thank you again for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again. Bye-bye.